What if the burning ship you are about to see in the Strait of Hormuz is not the end of a crisis, but the opening scene of something much bigger? Because the most dangerous part of this war may not be the missiles. It may be the fact that several separate conflicts are beginning to connect. A tanker burns in the water. An Iranian surveillance position is struck. American forces move into position. And thousands of miles away, oil markets begin calculating what happens if the world's most important maritime choke point becomes a permanent battlefield. Everyone is watching the fire, but almost nobody is watching what the fire is revealing. The hero of this story is a narrow strip of the Strait of Hormuz. On a satellite image, it looks almost insignificant. A thin passage separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. But beneath that narrow blue line lies one of the most consequential pieces of geography on Earth. Because this is where military power, energy security, global commerce, and national survival collide. And that is why the question surrounding Hormuz has never really been whether Iran can disrupt shipping. The question is what happens when disruption itself becomes a weapon. For decades, Iran has understood the strategic value of this geography. The strait is narrow, the coastline is close, and every ship passing through it enters a battle space where missiles, drones, mines, surveillance systems, and naval forces can potentially interact. That gives Iran something unusual. A country with a smaller conventional military can still threaten a much larger economic system. But here is the first contradiction. The same geography that gives Iran leverage also gives its enemies a target. Every radar station watching the strait can be found. Every missile battery protecting the coast can be attacked. Every port supporting military operations can become part of the battlefield. And every disruption that hurts the global economy also threatens Iran's own ability to export the energy that keeps its economy alive. The strait is not simply Iran's weapon. It is also Iran's vulnerability. That contradiction is the key to understanding what happens next. Because once the strait becomes the center of a war, the conflict stops being purely military. It becomes economic, it becomes political, and eventually it becomes global. Look at the map. The Gulf opens toward the strait. Beyond it lies the Arabian Sea. Beyond that, the Indian Ocean. Tankers move through this narrow passage carrying energy toward markets across Asia. The physical distance between the battlefield and the average American household may be thousands of miles. But the economic distance is almost zero. A disruption in Hormuz can become a higher fuel price. A higher fuel price can become higher transportation costs. Those costs can move through factories, airlines, shipping companies, and eventually into the daily lives of people who may never have heard the name of the strait before. That is the second contradiction. The battlefield may be regional. The consequences are not. And that is why every military movement around Hormuz carries a second meaning. A strike against a radar installation is not just a strike against a radar installation. It is a message about who controls the water. A tanker attack is not just an attack on one ship. It is a test of whether commercial traffic can continue under pressure. And a naval deployment is not simply about protecting vessels. It is about convincing the world that the strait remains open. This is where the visible war begins to reveal something deeper. Because everyone sees the missiles, everyone sees the ships, everyone sees the smoke. But the real struggle is over something much harder to film. Confidence. Can a shipping company still trust the route? Can an insurance company still price the risk? Can a government still guarantee that its energy supply will arrive? Can a military force protect the waterway without triggering an even larger war? Those questions cannot be answered by destroying a single target. They require a system, and systems are where modern wars become complicated. Iran's military strategy around Hormuz has long relied on exactly that complexity. Not necessarily defeating a stronger opponent in a traditional battle, but creating enough uncertainty that the stronger opponent is forced to spend enormous resources responding. One missile launch creates a military problem. One suspected mine creates a shipping problem. One damaged tanker creates an insurance problem. And suddenly, a relatively small military action begins producing consequences far beyond the original target. But here is the problem. That strategy only works while the opponent remains uncertain about how far to respond. If the United States concludes that the strait itself is becoming the battlefield, the response can expand rapidly. Surveillance aircraft appear overhead. Warships move closer, fighter aircraft increase patrols, refueling tankers extend the range of operations, and suddenly, the geography that once protected Iran begins concentrating American military attention on the exact same coastline. This is where the story becomes dangerous, because a choke point does not merely concentrate ships, it concentrates decisions. Every movement becomes visible. Every warning becomes a potential escalation. Every mistake becomes harder to contain. Imagine a radar screen inside a command center. A small contact appears. Is it a commercial vessel, a military ship, a drone, a decoy? The operator has seconds to decide, and somewhere else, another operator is watching the same picture through a completely different lens. The war does not need a deliberate decision to escalate. It only needs two sides to misunderstand each other at the wrong moment. And that brings us to the most important contradiction in this entire story. The more powerful the military force becomes, the more pressure it can apply. But the more pressure it applies, the more incentive the weaker side has to search for unconventional ways to create risk. That is why the strait remains so important. Not because Iran can necessarily defeat the United States at sea, but because Iran may not need to. It only needs to make the cost of keeping the strait open high enough that political leaders begin questioning how long the fight can continue. The lesson here is simple. Military superiority does not automatically produce strategic control. Control requires something more. It requires the ability to keep the system functioning after the first strike. And that means protecting ships, protecting ports, protecting energy infrastructure, protecting supply chains, and perhaps most importantly, protecting the political willingness to keep doing all of it. Because the longer Hormuz remains unstable, the more the battlefield moves away from the water. It moves into boardrooms, into oil markets, into military headquarters, and into political debates, thousands of miles from the strait itself. That is why the burning tanker is only the visible part of the story. The real question is, what happens when the world's most important maritime choke point becomes a test of endurance? Who can keep operating longer? Who can absorb the economic pressure? Who can replace damaged infrastructure? Who can maintain public support? And who can create enough uncertainty to force the other side to reconsider its next move? Everyone is watching the ships, but the real war may already be moving somewhere else. And if the Strait of Hormuz is the hero of this story, then its greatest power may not be the ability to stop the world's energy supply. It may be the ability to make everyone wonder whether it is safe to keep moving at all. Everyone thinks the battle for the Strait of Hormuz is about ships, but the real battle is about decisions. Because a missile does not have to sink a tanker to achieve a strategic effect. Sometimes, the possibility that a tanker fay be hit is enough. An insurance company raises its rates. A shipping company changes its route. A captain slows down. A government releases emergency reserves. And suddenly, the physical battlefield has expanded into the global economy. The weapon is no longer just the missile. The weapon is uncertainty. This is the invisible battlefield beneath Hormuz. And it explains why the strait matters far more than its size suggests. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf. You can see the geography, but you cannot see the calculations happening behind it. Inside a military headquarters, commanders are asking how many ships can be protected. Inside an oil company, Executives are asking how long supplies will last. Inside a trading room, analysts are watching every movement of crude prices, and inside political capitals across Asia, governments are calculating how much disruption their economies can absorb before public pressure begins to rise. One narrow waterway, thousands of separate decisions. That is the real battlefield. And this is where military power begins to collide with economics. A modern military can destroy a radar tower, it can strike a missile battery, it can suppress a coastal defense system, but it cannot simply bomb confidence back into existence that has to be rebuilt. One ship at a time, one convoy at a time, one successful passage after another. The strategic objective, therefore, is not simply to defeat Iran's forces. It is to convince the world that commercial traffic can continue despite them. That is a much harder problem, because military victory and economic normality are not the same thing. A coastline can be heavily defended and still function. A coastline can also be heavily bombed and still remain dangerous. And that is the paradox facing both sides. Iran wants leverage, but too much disruption could destroy the economic system it depends on. The United States wants freedom of navigation, but maintaining that freedom may require a sustained military presence that becomes increasingly expensive and increasingly difficult to defend politically. Neither side can easily achieve its objective without creating a new problem. That is the contradiction that keeps the crisis alive. And the consequences extend far beyond Iran and the United States. Because energy is the bridge between the battlefield and the rest of the world. Imagine an oil tanker leaving the Gulf. Its destination may be thousands of miles away, but its cargo is already connected to factories, power stations, airlines, trucks, and shipping networks. A disruption in Hormuz does not remain in Hormuz. It travels, it moves through prices, then through inflation, then through political pressure, and eventually it can reshape strategic decisions in countries that were never planning to participate in the war. This is why the Strait is more than geography. It is leverage, and leverage changes the behavior of everyone around it. But there is another layer. The Strait is not the only choke point that matters. To the southwest lies the Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea. If instability spreads there as well, the world could face pressure on two major maritime arteries at the same time. Now imagine the map again. Hormuz on one side, Bab el-Mandeb on the other. Between them lies a region where missiles, drones, naval forces, proxy groups, and commercial shipping routes overlap. Suddenly, this is no longer one maritime crisis. It becomes a network. And networks are difficult to contain. A conflict that begins with one shipping lane can create pressure on another. A strike in one country can trigger retaliation somewhere else. A military deployment designed to deter one actor can be interpreted as preparation for attacking another. The battlefield becomes, and that is where the danger increases. Because the more actors involved, the less control any single government has over escalation. Iran may control its own military decisions, but it does not necessarily control every action taken by regional groups aligned with Tehran. Washington may control its own forces, but it cannot perfectly predict how every part and commercial ships operate according to their own calculations. This creates a dangerous environment where the system itself begins generating escalation. A single mistake can become a strategic event. A missile fired at the wrong target, a drone misidentified, a naval vessel moving too close, a mine discovered in the wrong place. The question is no longer whether anyone wants a wider war, the question becomes whether everyone can prevent one. And that brings us to technology. Modern warfare has made the Strait simultaneously more transparent and more dangerous. Satellites can track movements, drones can monitor ships, radar systems can detect aircraft, electronic warfare can disrupt communications. Artificial intelligence can process enormous amounts of information. But more information does not necessarily create better decisions. Sometimes it creates faster mistakes. A commander who receives 10,000 pieces of data still has to decide what matters. A radar operator still has to identify a contact. A pilot still has to decide whether a signal represents a real threat. The battlefield may be technologically advanced. The human problem remains ancient uncertainty, fear, time pressure, and incomplete information. This is why the future of Hormuz may not be determined by whoever owns the largest fleet. It may be determined by whoever manages uncertainty better. The United States has enormous advantages in surveillance, air power, naval operations, and logistics. Iran has geographic advantages, dispersed capabilities, and the ability to operate inside a battle space where every commercial vessel becomes part of the strategic equation. One side possesses overwhelming military power, the other possesses the ability to complicate its use, and that creates an unusual form of strategic competition. The stronger side is trying to restore normality. The weaker side is trying to make normality expensive. That distinction matters because wars are rarely won by destroying the most targets. They are won when one side can impose its preferred political outcome, and that is where the military campaign returns to diplomacy. A military operation can open a negotiation. It can also destroy one. A strike can demonstrate strength. It can also convince the other side that compromise is no longer possible. The strait, therefore, becomes a bargaining chip. But bargaining chips become dangerous when both sides believe they can still gain more by escalating. This is why the possibility of negotiations never fully disappears. Even during periods of military confrontation, governments continue to communicate. Back channels remain open. Intermediaries carry messages. Prisoner exchanges happen. Diplomats meet quietly. Because beneath the public rhetoric, every government understands the same uncomfortable truth. There is no permanent military solution to a crisis like this. Even if one side achieves battlefield superiority, the political problem remains. How does the conflict end? Who guarantees shipping? Who rebuilds damaged infrastructure? Who pays for the economic disruption? Who convinces commercial operators that the water is safe again? And perhaps the most important question, who controls the narrative afterward? That is why the future of Hormuz may ultimately depend less on the next missile than on the next decision. If the United States expands military operations, it may restore short-term deterrence, but it may also increase the incentive for Iran to find new ways to create pressure. If Iran intensifies attacks on shipping, it may gain leverage, but it may also create the justification for a much broader international response. If regional actors become involved, the conflict could become harder to control. And if the nuclear question enters the center of the confrontation, the strategic calculation changes completely. Then the strait is no longer the main battlefield. It becomes only one piece of a much larger struggle. That is the future implication that should concern everyone. A war can begin with a narrow objective, but once military, economic, technological, and political systems become connected, the war develops momentum of its own. The Strait of Hormuz becomes connected to the global oil market. The oil market becomes connected to domestic politics. Domestic politics influences military decisions. Military decisions affect diplomacy, changes regional alliances, and those alliances reshape the battlefield. The system becomes circular, and the longer the pressure continues, the harder it becomes to identify where the original conflict even began. That is why the burning tanker matters. Not because one ship can decide a war, it cannot. The tanker matters because it represents a question that the entire global system must answer. How much risk is the world willing to tolerate before strategic behavior changes? If commercial ships continue sailing, the threat loses some of its power. If ships stop sailing, the threat becomes strategically successful even without a major naval victory. That is the paradox. The strait can be physically open and still function as a strategic weapon. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of modern warfare. The battlefield is no longer limited to where the explosions happen. It includes the decisions made because people fear the next explosion. It includes the ships that never sail, the investments that never happen, the aircraft that remain on alert, the reserves that governments begin stockpiling, the alliances that quietly shift. The question is no longer whether Iran can completely close the Strait of Hormuz. The real question is whether Iran can make the world behave as though the strait is already closed. Because if it can, then the battle has moved far beyond the water. It has entered the global economy, it has entered political calculations, it has entered military doctrine, and it has entered the minds of everyone who depends on that narrow strip of blue water remaining open. That is why Hormuz may become one of the defining strategic tests of modern warfare. Not a test of who has the biggest weapon, not a test of who can launch the most missiles, but a test of who can keep their system functioning under pressure, because the side that survives may not be the side that wins every engagement. It may be the side that can absorb uncertainty longer, adapt faster, spend less, and keep making rational decisions while everything around it becomes increasingly irrational. The question is no longer, who controls the Strait of Hormuz? The real question is, who controls the decisions that the strait forces the rest of the world to make? And that is the question I want to leave with you. If a narrow waterway can influence military strategy, global energy prices, political stability, and international diplomacy, all at once, do you think the next great wars will be fought over territory or over the world's most important systems?